Good morning to everyone. I understand you're muted, so you can't answer me with a good morning, but I can hear it through the Zoom. So thank you very much. I'm going to be talking for a short while, and also with Justin's help, showing some slides of the Jews of Jamaica and my experiences as the rabbi there. Over the 5-year period from 2011 to 2015, 2016. So thank you for having me. Justin, I think we're ready to start the slideshow, and then we'll go back and forth, and we'll unmute you as well, so you can make some short comments or ask some questions as we go along rather than only at the end. Jamaica Rabbi, the Jews of Jamaica from Columbus to today. I know Columbus, so I was there after he had left, but his family controlled the island under the Spanish. There's all sorts of stories that are, unfortunately, since Columbus burned all of his papers, we don't know for sure, but there are stories that he was of Jewish background. That may not be true, but in any case, his family would not let the Inquisition into Jamaica, and so therefore you could not prosecute conversos, people who had converted to Christianity from Judaism and were suspected of not being good Christians. They could not be prosecuted or persecuted in Jamaica. Okay, Justin, you can move ahead. This is the synagogue in Jamaica, and this is it's right kitty corner to the Parliament downtown. The neighborhood is somewhat iffy, but it's a beautiful, majestic building, well over 100 years old. Now, why only 100 years old? Well, the Jewish community and the synagogue go back more than 350 years, but there's a lot of earthquakes. There's hurricanes, there's all sorts of natural and political disasters. And so buildings tend not to last that long. The previous synagogue had just been built, in fact, on the same site. And in the very early 20th century, in 1907, there was a huge earthquake which destroyed a lot of downtown Kingston, including the synagogue. And this was built 5 years later, 1912, to replace that structure. It's a Spanish-Portuguese style building, and so it's got a balcony up top, which was originally used for the women. Although in the last many decades, everyone sat together, and it had sand floors as well. Okay, Justin, you can move ahead. Here you can see another view of the synagogue. So until Chabad came in, and you know the joke that when the astronauts are going to land on Mars, they're going to be greeted by a delegation from Chabad. And so during my stay, a Chabad couple came to visit, quote unquote, for a week. And then about 6 months later, they decided to come back. Whereas most of the Jewish community is in the southeastern part of the country, in Kingston, they settled in the northwest, which is about a 3.5-hour drive in Montego Bay. And that was a very interesting choice because there were only 3 or 4 members of our congregation up there, none of whom would be regarded as Jewish by Orthodox criteria. But they were planning to cater primarily to tourists. And how do you know when a Jewish tourist come? Well, if they're connected to their Chabad group in New York or Los Angeles or Toronto or wherever, and they say to their Chabad rabbi in Toronto, I'm going to Jamaica for a few weeks, the rabbi will ask them, well, which hotel, and he will then convey that information to the Chabad couple in Montego Bay. Anyway, this is the synagogue building in Kingston. You can see how majestic it is. Okay, keep going, Justin. And here's inside. You can see the balcony. You can see the Heichal, and the front part. You know that all the wood there. That's the Aron, and they had 13 Torahs. And you know, I guess it's probably true in most congregations. It's very hard to keep track when you have a lot of Torahs, where each one came from and how old it is, and you know, how it came to be in the congregation. And this was true here. So there had been quite a few synagogues, and as the synagogues disappeared, they would give their Torahs to this congregation. Okay, and here you can see an interior view. To the right is the Heichal. So unlike in most American synagogues, the Torah reading was done from the middle, and that continued to be our practice. And you can see the balcony as well, where usually no one sat. But we did have a Jewish reggae band, and so we pretty much filled up the entire temple, and so people went up there. Okay. And so how did this come about? I was a rabbi in Temple B'nai Israel in Albany, Georgia, for 10 years. This is our temple there. And at the end of my 10 years, a lot of people were leaving Albany for Atlanta. This is in the post 2008 economic changes and so forth, and the congregation was definitely getting a lot smaller, and so I decided I needed to make a change, and I wanted an adventure. So there were only 3 or 4 World Union congregations available that year. I remember looking at Geneva for about 10 minutes. And although I took 6 years of French in high school, I really couldn't speak it. And it looked beautiful in the first row of photos. But then when I scrolled down and I saw what it looked like in winter, I decided, no, I don't think I could survive. So the only warm weather foreign pulpit available that year was Jamaica. So that's where I went. Okay, Justin. This is just a little bar on one little street, but I think it indicates just how common the Jewish residual influence is. Mendes is a well-known Portuguese Jewish last name. And you see Jewish names, Spanish and Portuguese Jewish names everywhere: De Souza, De Costa, Mendes, etc. And so they conservatively estimate that 10% of all Jamaicans, there's about 3 million Jamaicans, that at least 10% have Jewish antecedents. So a lot of people would gradually fade out of the community and just sort of, you know, assimilate into the broader community and take their names with them. Other people had 2 families. They had their establishment white Jewish family, and they had their not white, not Jewish second family, and they would go back and forth. And so there was a whole kind of system built up unofficially about how do you handle things like that. And for 100 years or more, there was an unofficial acceptance of this sort of thing, that the upper class in general frequently had such an unusual marital system. And that also contributed to a lot of Jamaicans with no knowledge of Judaism or not having been raised in Judaism having Spanish Portuguese last names. Okay, Justin. Here you can see the Heichal inside the temple. This was when Brad Pomerantz of Jewish Life TV came. They did a documentary which you can find on film festivals, Children of the Inquisition, and they were tracing the what happened to all of the Jews of who were expelled from Spain and Portugal, and where they went and what happened to them. And so one of the places they came was Jamaica. You can see his very professional looking camera to the left, and that's me up on the Heichal in the distance. All right, let me just pause for a minute, and if anyone would like to say, just make some short comments or questions, I'll make it a little more interactive, so it's just not me talking. I see somebody. You can wave with your hand. I see somebody's waving. You can also, there's a little thing there to actually use an artificial hand. Yes.
Okay, actually, I'm wondering, is there any indication of why the family burned his papers? Would it be the fact that he actually may have been a conversion? That is Columbus's papers.
He was hiding something. I did a little research on this. Solo Baron, a very famous Jewish historian from Columbia University, did write about that. We don't know why he burned his papers. There was a lot of really suspicious things that didn't fit in terms of his biography and his life. I think Baron set down 6 or 7 or 8 different possibilities of what he was hiding, one of which was that he was from a converso family. The evidence is inconclusive. I think the preponderance suggests that there were other possibilities that were more likely. But whatever it was, his family, as a result, was not sympathetic to the Inquisition. So when we read about the Spanish Inquisition, you can sometimes get the idea that all the Spanish supported this, and that was not the case. Like today, many people didn't think about it. Many people did not support it, but wanted to keep their mouths shut because they could be hauled in front of the Inquisition themselves. There was a variety of opinions on that. I see Linda is asking about whether the temple was Ashkenazic or Sephardic. I mentioned how in 1907 the earlier temple on the same spot had been destroyed in an earthquake, and so this building was built in 1912. And around there were in Kingston 2 congregations at that time, Spanish Portuguese and a British German. And they had been trying to merge for really decades. There's 26 cemeteries on the island, and right in downtown Kingston, or within about 20 blocks of the temple, there was to the west the main Jewish cemetery, which was originally Spanish Portuguese, and to the east there was a British German cemetery. And it was interesting because I asked about being buried there. They had only about 10 or 15% of the graves were occupied, but the government had closed the cemetery, so it was there, but no further graves could be dug. I'm not exactly sure for the reason of that. In any case, eventually in 1921, the 2 congregations did merge, and it became a united congregation of Israelites. So it's called Congregation Sha'arei Shalom, And anytime you hear the word shalom in the title of a synagogue, beware, it's an aspiration rather than a description of fact. And they had a lot of fights. And so when they merged, there was a group of Spanish Portuguese Jews that didn't want the merger. There was a group of British German Jews that didn't want the merger. So they took two congregations, made it one, and then a group from each congregation broke off. And so they ended up with 3 congregations as a result of the merger. Eventually, these 2 dissident factions came back into the fold. And for the last 60 or so years, there's been one congregation in Kingston. It started reforming in the early 20th century already. By the 1970s, it was affiliated with the World Union for Progressive Judaism, but not everybody was on board with that as well. So when I got there, it was officially both. It was a merger of the Sephardic and the Ashkenazic, and it was officially progressive. So other questions or comments right now?
I have a question.
Okay, yes.
Getting back to this marital situation, was that unique to Jamaica, or did you find this was true in other Caribbean areas?
It was true in other Caribbean areas. Each one handled a little bit differently. Now, I mentioned that this was a Sandford synagogue, and there were 6 or 7 Sandford synagogues around the Caribbean. They all apparently were from because of Spanish Portuguese Jews who left, who snuck out of Portugal. Now remember, in Portugal, in Spain, the Spanish king and queen, Isabel and Ferdinand, gave the Jews 90 days to either sell up and leave or convert. In Portugal, the king was going to do something similar, but he realized it would be too costly economically. So eventually he gathered all the Jews at the port. They thought they were getting on boats to leave. And he just sprinkled them with water, like with water hoses. And he said, "You're all now Catholic." But don't worry, we're not going to have an inquisition for at least 18 years. So nobody's going to check your tzitzit, as they say. So everybody went home and they did what they were going to do. And after 18 years, the king said, "Don't worry, I'm giving another 18 years. So, but after 36 years, then they started an inquisition. So at that point, Jews who wanted to be Jewish or those who worried about being arrested by the Inquisition for other reasons started to very discreetly try to leave the country. But you couldn't buy like a plane ticket and start packing and having a yard sale and stuff. They would arrest you. So you had to somehow sneak out of the country. And, if you had a family, you couldn't say, "I'm going on a business trip and I'm taking my 6-year-old and my 4-year-old. So it was not an easy thing to do. They ended up in many different Caribbean ports. For example, Suriname. They had they had 2 synagogues in the Savannah Udin, which was an area about 60 miles from the main city, and it was a farming area with a lot of Jews there. They had a synagogue for white Jews and a synagogue very close by for black Jews. So they handled things differently. And whether these were children of the Jewish business people or whether they were slaves who had converted to Judaism, that's a little bit of both, maybe. So, how the Jewish communities in various cities handled issues of race and gender and marriage varied depending on who was running the country. So Curacao, which was Dutch, was very different than Jamaica, which was originally Spanish and then became British. So, good question.
during your period of time, did you have Black Jews in your congregation?
Yes, yes, and I'll get to that if time allows. We have a lot of slides, and so we just figured we'll show as many slides as we can in an hour, and then we'll stop wherever we get to. But there was a very ambivalent attitude on the part of the leadership towards converting people who had Black heritage. And so there were some, but it was a predominantly white congregation, and I don't think they really they didn't orientate me enough about how they felt about race, and so I just I was just dealing with individual people regardless of race, and that was probably naive in a post-colonial British context. Any other questions? Okay, well then we can go on.
Yeah, Rabbi, I have a question.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I have two questions. One is on Georgia, on Albany, because I actually did an audit there back in the 80s. I didn't know there was a shul. When did the shul start there?
Oh, it's been there since 1875.
Oh, wow, I wish I knew.
When we were there, that was downtown, and very prominent spot. And then this synagogue was built in 1999, and they moved at that time to the suburbs, and they had a beautiful wooded area and everything. But when I was there, they had 100 families, and now they're down to 30 families.
Wow, I can believe it.
So
my other question is, I've been to some of the other shuls in the Caribbean, like Curacao, Barbados, St. Martin, St. Thomas. And remind me the significance of the sand on the floor. Is that so they don't hear you in there?
Good question. Well, nobody knows the significance.
Okay.
The story is that in Portugal, remember that there was no Inquisition originally, that Jews nevertheless, continued to worship, but they couldn't use synagogues anymore. So they gathered in, some person had a big living room, but they didn't want to make too much noise, because even though people kind of knew what they were doing, they didn't want people walking by and hearing Hebrew prayers. That would be a little bit over the top. So they put down clay on the living room floor to muffle people's voices and also to muffle their foot movement. When they came to the Caribbean, clay became sand, and they kept the sand as a reminder of the clay that they'd used in Portugal. That's the official story. I believe that probably it had nothing to do with that rather there was in Amsterdam, public buildings such as bars and things put down sand when you entered because it was very rainy. And so people would come into the bar or restaurant or wherever, or church with their wet feet, and you didn't want them stomping all over with their wet feet and getting the floor all slippery. So you'd put a lot of sand, particularly in the entrance, which would absorb the moisture, and then you didn't have people slipping. So the Spanish Portuguese Jews, who then escaped from Portugal, went to Amsterdam, reconverted back to Judaism there, such as the family of Spinoza, who a very famous philosopher, but they never moved to Jamaica. And then they moved to the Caribbean, some of them. The Dutch East India Company you've heard of. And there was a lot of trade going on. So they brought with them this idea of a sand floor. So, and there's other theories about why they had a sand floor. All I can tell you is that I went through about 30 pairs of dress shoes. Toward the end, the last 5 or 6 months, I just gave it up and I kept wearing the same shoes. But the sand that they had there came from a quarry. So it was originally, I guess it was sand from the beach, but that was illegal. You couldn't just go to a beach and take sand. So you boiled it, and the sand had some chemical in it that really did a job on leather. Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you. That was very interesting.
Any other quick questions? I saw something floating on the screen, but I missed it.
You should have worn rubber sole tennis shoes.
Uh,
Like Orthodox
yeah.
wear on the high holidays.
Yes. And my first high holy days, I wore a suit with a jacket and everything. And the president there kept saying, take off your jacket, because, that was a question I saw floating at the bottom. So they did have I don't know how they electrified the synagogue. I don't think when it was built in 1912 would it have had electricity, but they couldn't air condition it because it was a very old building and had lots of windows that you couldn't seal at all. And so there was no way you could have air conditioning. So it got kind of hot there. But I kept wearing a tie and a jacket. Now, what was interesting is that Jamaicans, middle and upper class Jamaicans, even though it's a tropical island, when they're working, they wear normal business attire, dress shoes, tie, white shirt, whatever. They're not going to bank meetings in shorts and a t-shirt. So there you could see the British influence in a lot of things. Okay, I guess we can go back and show a few more slides, and then I'll give you a little more time to ask some questions as well. This is back to your question about other islands. The guy to the right was a visitor from Suriname. So he was a South American Jew. Suriname's in South America, but it was one of the sand floor synagogues. Now, what exact background he came from, I don't know, but you can see his skin is quite darker than the Jamaican Jews. And he clearly had a very different cultural background and so forth. But the affinity between the sand floor synagogue members in different places is very, the service was still quite similar. The efforts to reform went usually on similar grounds. And this was not the guy in the middle is a very prominent art collector in Jamaica, and during my time was given the highest civilian award that the Governor General, who's the representative of the Queen, can give to anyone. And what you see they're in the Heritage Center, which is next to the synagogue, which is basically a large social hall, but they've also made it into a museum. Okay. Now this is the Savannah Uden. This is the what remains of one of the synagogues in Suriname. And so, there's no more Jews in this area. It's, as I said, way outside the capital in what was a agricultural area. I don't know if this was the quote-unquote white synagogue or the black synagogue, but the Historical Society there has preserved what's left of it, and you can see just a little bit is there. Okay. Uh-oh, I hear some noise in the background, so maybe that we can mute that. Here you see, so one of the things that we did was give tours. And Jamaicans feel a tremendous sense of ownership of their Jewish heritage. So Jamaicans were very proud that there was such a prominent Jewish history in the country. And so school children, adults, all sorts of people would come to visit the synagogue. And that was a school group. This is a group from the American Friends of Ben Gurion University. And so these were major philanthropists donating to Israel. And the organization put together for them a 4-day heritage tour of Jamaica. And I was able to go with them on most of their tour. They had the guy in the middle is a very good tour guide. And we're seeing here Port Royale, which was the original city. It's there's this little islet at the coast of Kingston that just juts out into the water, and at the end of that is now a fishing village called Port Royale. But at once time before the huge an earlier earthquake in the 1600s destroyed most of it and buried it underwater. It's the largest underwater unexplored archaeological site in the world. But this was called the wickedest city in the West.
Yeah.
It had the first synagogue in Jamaica, and it was a center for pirates and for merchants and for all sorts of people fleeing from their past. And then most of the city was destroyed in this earthquake, and after that, the center of the country moved first to Spanish Town, which is a little inland, and then to Kingston. Okay, next slide. And this is just another picture from Port Royale showing the same group. And Disneyland at one time was interested in making it into a tourist attraction, but it never came about. But you could see the potential for that. At one point I thought I'll buy a house there, but there's only a few hundred houses, and there were none for sale. Okay. And one more picture. This is inside the museum in Port Royale. Okay.
Was that other picture on top of the, like a rooftop of the synagogue?
Correct. No, not of the synagogue, of one of the remaining buildings in Port Royale. Here you can see Port Royale from another view. There was a fort built there as well a little bit later. But the city never recovered from the earthquake.
Rabbi.
And if you go to Jamaica today, you'll see it's a little fishing village.
Well, first
Yeah.
name is Dana.
Okay, and you can, here's the fort, and you can go ahead, Justin. And this is one of the remaining buildings. You can see that it was toppled over as a result of the earthquake. But this is from a later earthquake, not from the original earthquake. Okay. Another view. Okay, this is Indrani Tombstone, and this is in Spanish Town. So what is interesting is you probably can't see it, but it's in memory of Luna Julia Andrade, the wife of David da Costa Andrade. So da Costa and Andrade are Spanish-Portuguese names. The wording is entirely in English, which is interesting. Many of the early graves are in Spanish and Hebrew. Others are in Portuguese and Hebrew. Some are in Spanish and Portuguese and Hebrew. And so you could see that the families came, although most of them probably went through Portugal, there were those who had really only been in Portugal a short time. And so Spanish was their native language, and that's what they wanted to put on their tombstones. There were others who were clearly Portuguese and had never been in Spain. The Andrades had obviously anglicized by this time. All Jews under the Spanish were called Portuguese. So they didn't nobody said there's no Jews in Jamaica. There's a group of what they called Portuguese. And Portuguese was really a euphemism for Jews, although not all the Portuguese wanted to be Jews, right? Just because they had Jewish ancestry. Once the British invaded, then those Jews who wanted to come out of the closet were allowed to, and they set up a synagogue in Port Royale. Others didn't. They said, you know, maybe our ancestors were Jewish, but we're not interested. So not everybody did that. But from that point on, you could have a synagogue, you could declare yourself as a Jew, and they did that. Okay. What was interesting is every year a group from the United States came, led by an architect, and they were there to document the cemeteries. And so there had been two scholars many years earlier, decades earlier, who had written a book about the gravestones of Jamaica. So they were using that as their basis, but those two guys had missed a lot of things, and things had changed since they'd been there. So this group was very carefully mapping all 26 cemeteries. Each year that they came, they picked 1 or 2 or 3 cemeteries to work in. This is in the biggest Jewish cemetery in downtown Kingston. Okay. And this is the same cemetery. Then Henrietta, the name of the congregation is Temple B'nai Israel in Albany, Georgia. It was the only temple in Albany. Now you can see here that the cemetery had some visitors during the daytime, and this was with the knowledge of the synagogue board. The goats ate the grass, so it saved them a lot of money in landscaping fees. The problem was that the goats would not stay off the stones themselves, and sometimes they would kick the stones and even break them. So the temple board had to balance the savings from the landscaping with the damage to the stones. Also, there was divergent opinions on whether it was considered respectable and respectful to allow goats to wander through a cemetery. So this was one of the issues that I had to deal with as the rabbi. Eventually, we did decide to end the arrangement with the goat herder, and I don't know where he found an alternative place to let his goats graze. Okay. And here's another picture of the goats. So you can see there the, okay, next. This is a friend of mine, Aubrey Messias, who was possibly the last affiliated Jew from Spanish Town. And so Spanish Town is just about 15 miles southwest of Kingston, but it was a tremendously important historical location. It had been the capital of Jamaica and the center of finances for a long time before Kingston sort of superseded it. It was still a pretty large city. What happened to the Jewish cemetery there, I don't know, but it was large, and at some point it was, a lot of it was destroyed, and there was a shopping mall built on a lot of it. But as you can see, there was still part that was just an empty field, and we were able to dig under some bushes and still find some Jewish stones. And, you know, so when Aubrey started to use his broom, some of the locals just came out to watch. Because they played in that lot all the time, and they never really paid attention to what was under the bushes. So I guess what happened is that there was at least 2 synagogues in Spanish Town. They'd both closed down more than 100 years ago, and the cemetery fell into complete disuse, and there was nobody to keep watching it. In America, we have perpetual care, and so when you buy a stone, there's normally a considerable fee that you pay that will hopefully guarantee that your stone will be taken care of in perpetuity. And everybody has to sign that. So the entire cemetery has its own trust fund, essentially. But that was not the arrangement in Jamaica. Okay. So while I was there was a lot of journalists came down. If you Google Jews of Jamaica, you'll find a lot of articles. This was because the Jamaica Tourist Board gave people free trips, and that was very useful. One of them was a cover story in Hadassah magazine, and they didn't put me on their cover, unfortunately. This is a famous Jewish artist who was active in the 1830s, 1840s, and so they took one, and he painted Black life, so they put one of his paintings on the cover. Okay. And there's a lot of the tourist sites have Jewish backstories. This is Devon House, which is considered the finest example of British colonial architecture in Kingston. It was built by the first Black millionaire in Jamaica, George Steeble. And George Steeble was Black, but his father was a German Jew. And he'd actually made his money in Venezuela, and then he came back to Jamaica and built this house. After he died, it was owned by 3 or 4 other families who were mostly Jewish as well. And then there were 4 mansions on this corner. Each corner had a very, very large house, but this is the only one of the 4 that's still standing. And so it was saved as a result of a conservation effort, and is now a museum. And if you go to Kingston, it's one of the must-see. The furniture inside was no longer there, so they had to go out and try to find old furniture to put, into the house. So the furniture is not the furniture that George Steeble and his family had, but it's presumably fairly similar. Okay, Justin. And this is just the emblem of Jamaica, and you can see the slogan, "Out of many, one people." And so you can see that with that kind of an approach, that the Jewish history was one out of many, one people. And so all the kids in school studied about out of many, how did the Jamaican people come about, all the different diverse cultural and religious and ethnic influences, including that of the Jews. Yes, so thank you, Barbara. Jamaica is a very religious country. The people bragged to me that there were more churches per capita than any other country in the world, they said. I don't know if that's true. What other people would say is there's more bars than churches. So there were just a lot of churches and even more bars. But it was a very religious country, although in recent decades, like everywhere in the world, it's become less so. And so that also created an environment where people who were alienated with Christianity still were very motivated to find religion. So there were a lot of people who were no longer Christians looking for a religion. So that was one of the reasons I felt that there was a lot of potential to do a lot of conversions, potentially. But, you know, as they say, sometimes it's easier to start your own congregation from scratch, and then you can do what you want. When you inherit a congregation, particularly one that's been around for more than 350 years, change is very difficult. This is the cornerstone of the synagogue, and you can see the background of it. Okay, and this is another site with Jewish background. This is the Gleaner, which is the major newspaper in Jamaica. Everybody reads the Gleaner even today. And it was established a few years before emancipation in 1834 by Joshua and Jacob de Cordova, who were Jamaican Jews. They left, they sold the newspaper shortly thereafter. And do you have any idea where they moved to? Texas.
Ooh.
So they moved to Texas, where they set up other institutions, and that you're going to have a Texan historian talk about that part of their careers. But the Gleaner is still in existence, and everybody knows that it was founded by Jews. It didn't mean that the Gleaner had a pro-Israel editorial policy, but one of the many institutions founded by Jews. Okay, keep going. This was at Simchat Torah, and this is the De Levante family. So this is another Portuguese family. And the woman to the right, Marilyn De Levante, was a historian of the community. She wrote one of the books on the history of the Jews of Jamaica, and that's her grandson to the left. So what I'm giving you here is just to see some of the Jamaican Jews, so you can actually see what their faces look like and get a sense. This is Maria Myers Hamilton from the congregation. Myers, M-Y-E-R-S, is also an ancient, a colonial Jewish surname. She was another active member. You can see the Heichal in the foreground and the Aron in the background. We're inside the synagogue. Okay, this is one of the people who did convert. His name was Niles. He's from Chinese background, so he had no Jewish ancestry that we know of. But what they call in Jamaica Chinese is not really what you'd see, in China. They were already, well integrated and quite mixed. So part of his background, he probably had ancestors who had all sorts of different backgrounds, but the prominent one, or the one that he identified with, was Chinese. Many of the merchants on the island were from this background. So the Chinese and Jews had very similar socioeconomic roles. And here is at his conversion. This is not really a swimming pool. This is the Rockland mineral baths, and it was running water from the mountains. So it was halachically a legitimate conversion because it's running water. And that's where we did our conversion. He's about to dunk in the water, and I'm reading part of the Tevilah ceremony. So we did do immersion for all people who converted. Okay. Okay, and this is Norma Haddad, and another a regular in the temple. She's now close to 100 years old, or relatively close to 100 years old, and still quite active. And but her late husband was a Lebanese non-Jew, so her surname was not a Jewish surname, but her family were from an old line of Jamaican Jews, and you can see some of the other people from the congregation in the background. Okay, keep going. Another Jamaican Jew, keep going. And another one. And go back one. This is go back one. That's Carl, and Carl is from a Central American Caribbean Jewish ancestry. Go back one if you can, Justin. If you can, all right.
I don't think I can go back.
And he was one of our main choir members, so he could sing very beautifully. And this is another member. You could see a Chinese background here as well. So the different communities had a lot of intermarriage. Okay, keep going. And this is Evelyn from a Syrian, a partial Syrian background. So this was Spanish Portuguese Jews that had moved to Syria and then on to Jamaica. And also her family was Syrian, her husband's family were Syrian, but she herself was just Ashkenazi. So her background was much closer to that of American Jews. Okay, keep going. And two of the leaders of the congregation, keep going. And this is me with Carl. This is in the house I had in the mountains. And this is a porch where I held a lot of activities. So the synagogue was downtown, which was a pretty bad area. Now I walked around, they told me not to, but I walked around during the daytime all around downtown, and I never had any problems. But they didn't advise that, and certainly at night people didn't want to drive down. So most people lived on the edge of the mountain, which was about 45 minutes away. This was a neighborhood called Norbrook, and so we held a lot of the activities just on my porch. Jamaica, it was warm, most of the year, so you could have outdoor activities. The reason that the more upper class settled away from the ocean on the side of the mountain was because of the hurricanes and so forth. So you didn't want to build a house right on the ocean. So the more desirable neighborhoods were away from the ocean, whereas in the United States, the closer you are to the ocean, the more desirable it would be. Okay, next. This is Patrick. So his great grandfather came from Israel, from Jerusalem, to raise funds for a yeshiva. In the 1800s, early 1800s, they sent out fundraisers, and his great grandfather stayed in Jamaica. And Patrick, however, was raised Catholic, and as an adult returned to Judaism. He was very fundamentalist, and he opposed everything I said and did. And he would sometimes heckle me from the back of the synagogue. But I found him endearing, and sort of a historical relic that he was one of a kind Jamaican Jew. There were a lot of unique personalities there. Okay, keep going. And this is in the middle, Jennifer, who was likewise of Spanish-Portuguese background. She was head of the women's organization a Wezo. And to the left, that is an Israeli who was living in Jamaica. The Israelis had a number of prominent businesses there. So you'd have a nice contingent of Israelis that joined the community. You could see some of the museum exhibits behind us. Okay. Another Jamaican Jew, Margaret, who volunteered to run the Jewish club, which was held at the Jewish school on Monday afternoons. So there's a Hillel Academy, which is one of the two most prestigious schools in Jamaica, along with the American International School. And Hillel Academy had several hundred students, of whom only a couple, maybe less than 15 were Jewish. So the school was called Hillel Academy. They gave off for certain Jewish holidays, but it was a secular school with no Jewish content. But we had our, basically our Sunday school, our Hebrew school on Monday afternoons there. Okay. And with this slide, I guess, is a good place to stop. This is a bar mitzvah. You can see the bar mitzvah boy is to our right, Val. His grandfather was the art collector that I showed you earlier. He was also from Texas. His father, Wallace's son, his name was Val, and his grandfather was Wallace. His father, which is Wallace's son, had left Jamaica for Texas, and they came back for the bar mitzvah. So this was a common thing, that people who'd emigrated would come back for the bar mitzvah. To the left is another young man whose family was still living in Jamaica, and he was active in the congregation. You can see me there. We didn't have a lavalier mic, so I had to hold this big microphone. Things were not as technologically advanced as they are in the United States. And you can see how we're dressed. It was probably in the 80s, no air conditioning. We did have a big fan right over the bima, but it was a little bit too far back, so it really, it mostly helped the people sitting behind me, not myself. So I think I had a little fan on the table there. Okay, I'm going to stop here, and Justin, if there's a few more questions, we have time to take a few more, and then I'll just conclude.
What was the name of the Jewish artist, Jamaican artist, in the 1830s? Was it Pizarro?
Say again?
Pizarro, I think, or something like that.
No, let me check for you.
Emile Pizarro was from a different island.
You're right. I've forgotten the island though. Yeah.
Yeah, check the Hoffman lady's novel about him.
Right. Very good novel.
Hold on. It is his name was Isaac Mendez Belisario.
Thank you.
And you heard the middle name Mendez, so it connects back to the bar that I showed you, Mendez bar. Also, the cantor at the synagogue was a doctor, a black doctor, whose name also was Mendez, and he had returned to Judaism as well. And Mendez Belisario, who died in 1849, was one of the most prominent Jamaican artists. Not everyone considers him a Jamaican artist because he was white, and I don't think he was he born in Jamaica? I'm not sure. But he painted mostly black people, and he did so sympathetically, but of course it was a different time period.
Marilyn, do you have a question? Yeah. Oh. There you
Can
go.
you hear me?
Yep.
I just wondered if there were any Yiddish speakers there, or because it was so Spanish and Portuguese, were they only Spanish and Portuguese speakers?
Well, the congregation in my time had a dribbling from everywhere. So there was a French Jewish lady who had survived the Holocaust. And her story was quite interesting. I don't think she spoke Yiddish, but she was from a Yiddish background. Her family escaped and was in southern France. And then when the Vichy government fell, the Germans came in. And at one point, they were in a two-story house, and the Nazis came in looking for Jews, and they ran upstairs, but they had nowhere really to hide. And the Nazis just looked on the first floor, and they just didn't come up the stairs. And then they escaped to Switzerland, and Switzerland were taking in Jewish refugees if there was a member of the family under the age of 6 or something like that. And her little sister was 5 years and 300 and something days. So if her little sister had been like 3 weeks older, they wouldn't have been admitted and they would have been killed. So she was full of stories like that. There was a Moroccan Jew. There was an Algerian Jew. There were some Israelis, I said. There were some Americans. There was an American architect who'd moved there, and he married a woman of Jamaican Jewish ancestry. And during the 1970s, the country almost became communist. And so people, pretty much everybody was fleeing. So this American guy had confidence, and he bought a beautiful house right on the water on the north coast in Portland, which is northeast. It's not so touristy, but it's beautiful. And, he got it on 5% or 10% of its value. And this is during the time that Michael Manley was prime minister. And Manley was a socialist who, was friendly with Fidel Castro. So this guy would always say that his weekend house was a gift from Michael Manley. But it was a huge risk because everybody was talking about how they were going to nationalize everything. So he could have easily lost the house.
Thank you.
In the 1980 election, the other party, Edward Seaga, won, and there was a little bit of a question whether Michael Manley would turn over the reins of government, but nobody really wanted Manley to stay in control because the Cubans, who were presumably his biggest ally, they were using Jamaica to break through the American blockade. And so if Jamaica went communist, there'd be an economic boycott of Jamaica as well. The Cubans would have a much harder time getting restocked. So Castro did not want Manley to declare a revolution either. So Manley really, even if he'd wanted to, there was really no one supporting him. And there were American government plans to actually invade if Manley refused to turn over power. But he did, and he died a national hero. And so to this day, Michael Manley is still very popular in the country, although he almost brought catastrophe to Jamaica. Any last questions? This is your opportunity.
I think Sandy has another question. Oh, she's muted there.
In one of the slides, I noticed 9 Torahs. Isn't that very large for that small congregation?
There were about and somebody asked this question. We had about 200 members in my time. There were 13 Torahs. And a lot of these Torahs came from other congregations. There were at least two synagogues in Spanish Town. So that must have been 5 or 6 of the Torahs at least. There was a synagogue in Montego Bay that closed down like 150 years ago. There is, so some of the Torahs came from other congregations. Other Torahs came from the 2 temples that became the United Congregation of Israelites, the British German and the Spanish Portuguese. They must each have had at least 2 or 3 Torahs apiece. So so the 2 Jamaica temples and the 2 Spanish Town temples, yeah, you're talking about at least 8 Torahs just from those 4 congregations, and probably more. So that would explain that. Yes, towards the end of my stay, I did buy a little house on the eastern shore, about 15 minutes east of Kingston, right on the ocean. I do worry about hurricanes, but it's right on the beach. And so the plan was to go back frequently and use that as my writing retreat. For reasons that are obvious and other reasons that are less obvious. I haven't gotten back there very much, but it's still there and it's still in one piece. And so I hope to be able to spend more time in Jamaica in the future. But I've been back, and I obviously still have a lot of friends there, and I'm connected to the congregation there. They did not replace me as a rabbi, so the lay leader who was leading the congregation, Stephen Henriques, who was leading the congregation for more than 10 years before my arrival, became the acting ritual director after I left as well.
Why didn't they get another rabbi?
Well, they'd been without a rabbi for 33 years before I arrived. I guess a lot of it is that they like doing things their way, and so they don't really want a rabbi. So I think that they're more comfortable. Some congregations are very lay-led, and it's a different dynamic, I think, structurally and administratively. So I was coming in to a congregation that hadn't had a rabbi for decades and trying to figure out how I could make a contribution without stepping on toes. And so that was a delicate tightrope, because on one hand, if you don't step on any toes, you're not really doing anything. And then things go on the way it was before, and, then what's the point of having a rabbi? On the other hand, if you step on too many toes, you get too many hurt feelings. So now we had a cantor that was Dr. Winston Mendez Davidson, and he was he was a volunteer cantor. He was a doctor, and he was a professor of medicine at the University of Technology in Kingston. And then Carl, who you saw, he did most of the services. There was a choir of men and women, but there were 4 or 5, but Carl was by far the most involved. So there was singing, because I sing worse than a sick frog. So certainly they didn't want me to do any of the singing. And now on Zoom, the cantor in Arizona, he said, "It's not that you have a bad voice, Dana," although he's probably thinking, "But you do." But when you sing on Zoom, it doesn't come out good because of Zoom. So just let me do the singing. But it was a really tremendous experience. I mean, obviously, being a rabbi in a Caribbean country is different than visiting on a cruise ship for a few hours. And of course, you see the problems as well as the benefits. The Jamaican people are very loving and sweet, and and they really embrace their Jewish heritage that is part of their country's history. Like many Caribbean islands, there's very limited economic resources, and so the governments have been trying to do what they can with aluminum, with coffee, with tourism, of course, is a big one, and a handful of other industries, but they don't have the economic possibilities that Switzerland or Canada or New Zealand might have.
Any other questions out there? No. Oh, Marilyn?
Just one. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, you were pronouncing it Albany, and I've always heard it as Albany. Are we pronouncing it wrong?
Yeah, I guess in Albany they put the stress on the middle syllable. So Albany is Albany, New York, and Albany, Georgia. And so,
I know that. Interesting.
now I was
Thank
the
you.
rabbi, just to conclude here, I was the rabbi for the whole island. So I made a number of trips to Montego Bay, to Negril, to Ocho Rios, to the eastern part of the country, to Clarendon in the west. And I met people with Jewish ancestry from all different farming places where they knew they were of Jewish background, but they hadn't really seen a Jew barely, and certainly not a rabbi for maybe generations. I saw some very small Jewish cemeteries where there hadn't been a burial for over 100 years. There were some in Montego Bay. There's a very sad bunch of graves that were from an epidemic. It wasn't coronavirus, but it was an earlier epidemic. I'm not sure which disease that hit in the 1840s. Jews have been emigrating for a long time because of limited economic opportunities, because of all the natural disasters, and because of all the diseases. I found I got several inquiries while I was there from Jews in Australia whose ancestors had come from Jamaica. Now, that seems like an awful far way to go, but they were both British Commonwealth countries, and so I guess there was a direct boat. So whether it took an hour or 3 months, you just got on the boat and you bought your ticket and you settled in for the ride. And so people were trying to trace their genealogy. And they said, well, my family's been in Melbourne for 160 years. But before that, my father's family, my mother's family, whoever, came from Jamaica. So, so the community diminished a lot, especially in the 1970s with the political turmoil. And virtually the entire middle and upper class left, at least temporarily. Some came back in 1980. And in the 1980s when things settled down, but many did not. And so the community is quite diminished. And, you know, how to maintain and fortify and reconstruct a small Jewish community, this is a challenge we're facing not only in the Caribbean, but throughout the world and in the United States. So it was a wonderful experience. I'm trying now to publish a little bit on it. I've got an article coming out in the next CCRR journal on Jewish religious conversion in Jamaica, which was very contested. And I'm hoping to write some more in the future. So thank you very much. I've really enjoyed my stay in Houston. And I'm sorry we didn't have more time to go out to more Houston restaurants, but maybe next time. And have a great day.